McCarthy has just published a book called Green Modernism, in which he looks at modernist writers, James Joyce, Beckett, D.H. Lawrence, in terms of the new green way of reading these earlier texts, modernist texts. Yeah? And he begins that book by saying modernist studies have tended to focus on the urban location of, Joyce's novels and so on. But actually, of course, there has always been a green presence. And indeed, there is now a book called Eco-Joyce. Ulysses is the story of Leopold Bloom going around Dublin during one day, and is an urban novel. But actually, Eco-Joyce reveals that there are all sorts of engagements in that novel with environments, with the river, for example, with the weather, and so on. Eco-Joyce is an edited book and now single studies. Joyce studies have been going for a very long time and are very popular, and there's been a plethora of essays and books about James Joyce, and Joyce scholars are looking for somewhere new to go. So where do they go? Eco-Joyce. Suddenly, other people, not committed eco-critics, are discovering eco-criticism as a new mode for coming at their specialism. Yeah? And I've been emphasizing all along that eco-criticism ought to be overlaid on specialisms rather than displacing them. And there's your example of Joyce scholars finding a new angle on James Joyce by editing a book called Eco-Joyce. And of course you're familiar with my idea that the pastoral has shifted into what I now call post-pastoral. And I want to mention contemporary Georgics. In my lecture on poetry, on pastoral, I missed out a section on Georgics, and I want to just very briefly make up for that now, because I think Georgics have been neglected. In my second edition of my pastoral book, there will be a new chapter on Georgic literature, which I've just written in Spain before I came here, and I'll come to that in a moment. Yes, the meaning of climate change is now very different from what it was previously. These meanings have all shifted. And on my website you'll see an essay that looks at how the British countryside in literature suddenly became the environment. How suddenly people regarded gardens as no longer decorative or productive, but as habitats. As habitats, the garden as habitat, and the countryside as environment. How did that happen? When did that happen? And there's an essay on my website that is coming out in a Cambridge University Press book imminently about changes in British culture 1960 to 1980. Yeah, so just to fill in a gap, I encourage people to get engaged with the Georgics of Virgil. Virgil's poem, the Georgics, defines the genre that we call Georgic literature. And Georgic literature is simply about the details of labour in the countryside, in engaging with nature in the countryside. Georgics focus on labour. You might call it husbandry. And indeed the 4 books of the Georgics deal with crops, trees, animals, and bees. Yes, we've been looking at the ancient Egyptian importance of bees. And as our guide said, bees provide free food. Bees, we're only now beginning to realise just how much we rely on bees now that, of course, too late, insecticides are banishing insect life in general and bees in particular. So when I go through the Central Valley of California where the almond trees are now produced and the cherry trees are now cropping. I find a lorry delivering beehives from the Midwest of America and planting a beehive at the end of every row of almond trees, because the chemicals which have been sprayed on the almond trees have killed off all the pollinators. And indeed, cheap Mexican labor is being used in some places in California to hand pollinate trees. Yeah? Only now are we realizing that what is called beehive colony collapse has been produced by our intensive agriculture and our great reliance on chemicals in agriculture. So, bees, okay. Actually, this is not didactic, Virgil's Georgics. It's not telling you how to do things so much as being descriptive of things that are done. And what the Georgics does is it tries to encourage human beings to listen to nature, to learn from nature, to observe nature in order to work with nature in producing food. Yeah? So it is exactly that humbling, that rejection of the conquest of nature that I've been saying is the first requirement of the post-pastoral, adopting a position of awe that humbles the human species, and that's what Virgil is doing in the Georgics. It's absolutely marvellous in its detail. It tells you which direction the wind's coming from and what that means, and so on and so on. And of course, there has been a British tradition of Georgic poetry. You may be unaware of this, but this is now beginning to be studied, particularly by 18th century scholars in England. 1599, there is a long poem called The Silkworms, about making silk, by Thomas Moffat. 1706, How to Make Cider, a long poem, a literary work, yeah, about harvesting apples and making cider. James Dyer, a book about growing sheep for wool, called The Fleece. And then in the 20s and 30s, there were a series of books that were produced by agricultural labourers that became best-selling texts, and often were used as classroom set texts, actually, for a certain period. Leavis particularly admired The Wheelwright's Shop by George Bourne, and Raymond Williams writes about, in The Country and the City, Fred Kitchen's Brother to the Ox. These are memoirs of working the land, produced by land workers themselves, yeah, but having a certain literary quality to them. So this is a tradition, often an ignored tradition, of Georgic literature, and I find it amazing that once I started looking for this, I found there are lots of Georgic books being produced today, some of them very popular, actually. Ted Hughes wrote a series of diaries about farming called Moortown Diary. It's very practical, very hands-on. It's about the dilemmas of a sheep and stock farmer in Devon. Alice Oswald wrote a long poem about the people who make a living alongside the River Dart. It's a Georgic work. A cook wrote a book about growing vegetables for his restaurant. The River Cottage is the name of the restaurant, the River Cottageer. And a novel from Wales, a very popular TV programme every Sunday in the UK, one of the most watched television programmes, informs urban people about what's going on in the countryside. It's called The Country File. And the farmer who is featured in The Country File every Sunday is Adam Henson, and he has produced a book which is a Georgian book about farming in 2011. And a best-selling book by a Cumbrian shepherd. Very well-written book about a family hill farm growing sheep in the Lake District. James Rebank's The Shepherd's Life was a bestseller. Another novel set in Wales. And Melvyn Bragg, a great cultural commentator in the UK, his daughter has written a novel set in the Lake District about sheep farming. Okay, so here's my 1960-1980, how we moved from a certain kind of nature writing represented by Gavin Maxwell, and of course the American writer Silent Spring, drawing attention to the effects of DDT in agriculture, making a silent spring because no birds sang because the insects had all been killed off by these terrible organochlorine pesticides, which are now banned as a result of Rachel Carson's very literary book, Silent Spring. Okay, well, here is a series of publications. All of these are in my essay on the website, and I discuss all of these on the website. But I come to Richard Mabey and The Common Ground, and in that book, The Common Ground, Richard Mabey is no longer writing about the countryside, he's writing about an environment under threat, and an environment in need of protection, and very much an environmentalist book. From a continuing, he's still alive, Richard Mabey, still bringing out a book every other year of British nature writing, one of the best British nature writers. Okay, so, you know all this, okay. Yes, I've been emphasising evaluation, haven't I? You know, evaluating texts, looking at strengths and weaknesses, which texts are post-pastoral and which are stuck in an escapist, idealised pastoral function in the pejorative use of the term, is one of the questions which I encourage people to ask of writing about the countryside. Which are the most useful climate change novels? And there are now quite a number of novels, and this has become quite a field of study in eco-criticism, looking at climate change novels. Must aesthetics be changed to accommodate crucial facts, information, scientific data? Do you remember, this is one of the questions that I raised about eco-poetry. Do we need to adjust our aesthetic evaluation because we need to allow eco-poetry to engage with the scientific evidence that we need to confront? Yeah? Can didacticism have a role in art speech? D.H. Lawrence uses the term art speech for novels, poetry, art, creative works. I find art speech a very useful form of discourse that is different from, well, didactic discourse. But is there a role for didacticism? You know, do we need to be taught things? Do we need to be told things? How can we be told things without being preached at in a way that is acceptable as poetry? So this is the challenge that we're facing, I think, in the Anthropocene as literary critics. Okay, there have been some critiques of the new nature writing. I said that there's a golden age in prose nature writing in Britain at the moment. This is called the new nature writing, and I co-edited an edition of Green Letters that collected together essays that were focusing on the qualities of new nature writing, which is nature writing aware of an environmental crisis being written in the UK now. Yeah? And here are two critiques, one in the Times Literary Supplement, the other in the New Statesman, and I'll just introduce you to those two critiques. Both of these people The first one is really accusing the new nature writing of being escapist pastoral stuff by and large, and the second one is saying it isn't radical enough, it isn't actually activist enough, Mark Cocker's critique. And here it is. How can we produce pastoral narratives when the realities underlying them are so sharply defined and their implications, social, political, cultural, so profound? You notice the pejorative use of pastoral here. Yeah? He's assuming that all pastoral writing is sentimental pastoral in neo-Marxist terms. Yeah? Very common in British discourse. But how can we be producing narratives that describe nature when the realities underlying them are so profound and need engaging with? Nature writers must ponder and engage with these troubling realities. Otherwise we're just fiddling while the agrochemicals burn. That's those agrochemicals that are cutting out the bee population and the insect life upon which birds depend, upon which pollination depends. The real danger is that nature writing becomes a literature of consolation, the only just past time when nature could be admired unproblematically. Yeah? That distracts us from the truth of our fallen countryside, or, just as bad, that it becomes a space for us to talk to ourselves about ourselves. That is, nature writers focusing on their own self-epiphany and uplift in going out into nature, which was the focus of the first wave of American eco-criticism. Yeah? Where, in fact, the writer was very, very much foregrounded in their engagement with nature and their personal uplift in engaging with nature. With nature relegated to the background as an attractive greenwash. So these are the dangers of, and these are the challenges to contemporary nature writers thrown out by the ornithologist Mark Cocker. Robert Macfarlane wrote a reply in the New Statesman. He says, first of all, we're witnessing cultural collaborations for environmental and human well-being as we haven't done before. And this is environmental humanities, as I said at the beginning. Cultural collaborations are taking place as never before for notice the pairing, that environmental well-being is tied in with human well-being. Yeah? That both of these things are interlinked. And Robert Macfarlane says, our golden age of pluriform, lots of different forms of nature writing, is at best ethically alert, theoretically literate, and wary of the seductions and corruptions of the pastoral. So here he is saying, the best of our nature writing is aware of the seductions of the pastoral. In other words, it's post-pastoral. It's aware of the dangers of idealising in the pastoral. And Mark Cocker's policing was instrumentalising literature's indirect action. Mark Cocker is wanting literature to be instrumentalising, in radicalising people on behalf of the countryside and behalf of bees and insect life. Whereas literature is a form of indirect action. Yeah? It's a really nice way of putting it. By the way, Robert Macfarlane is Director of Studies in English Literature at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. We're dealing here with someone who's a Cambridge academic, very young in his career, who has really championed the development of new nature writing in the UK, and as a practitioner in his own books has explored the possibilities of the new nature writing in the UK. So down with disdain and division, and up with celebration and connection. Okay, so here's my familiar image of the British pastoral in the Anthropocene, with which the tensions and paradoxes of which you're familiar. Can poetry disrupt the logic of global capital? Well, can it? Can it contribute to the cultural shift in sensibility, in values? Ask the awkward questions. I think this is what poetry does. Yeah? Poetry doesn't disrupt the logic of global capital, but it just drip, drip, drip contributes to the cultural shift in sensibility, in what we value, in asking the awkward questions. Can the poet talk to the policymaker? Okay, so these are questions for environmental humanities in confronting climate change in the Anthropocene. And so I come to a poem of my own, which attempts to do some of these things. I went with a group of MA creative writing students at their tutor's invitation to take a walk down a footpath beside the boundary to a new nuclear power station which is being built at Hinkley Point in Somerset, near where I live. And the project was set up by a poet to invite poets to write a poem at a point on that footpath and to locate it by GPS so that other people could come with an app and read on their phones the poem written in that place, yeah, down this footpath. And you'll see the title of this project at the bottom here. It's called A Walk Down the Rift. The rift is the footpath down to the sea alongside the fence of the newly being built Hinkley Point power station with Chinese money and French expertise. And here is it's called Poetry Pin, the website, Poetry Pin. So I walked down the footpath and I walked out as far as I could at low tide, and I sat down on a rock there and I wrote this. At this nuclear power station, the current power station that's being built is called Hinkley C. Hinkley A has been decommissioned. That was the first power station on this site. It's finished, it's been decommissioned. Hinkley B is currently producing power at the moment. So this new one, this controversial one, is called Hinkley C. I call this poem Hinkley G, and I hope you see what the G stands for. So the tide is going out, okay, and I'm sitting on this rock, so I've chosen the fawn to represent the tide going out. Blinding morning sunlight reflects from rippled sand, still running with rivulets of star-pulled tide drain, the old energy, undated as yet for decommissioning. Decommissioning is the word that you use when the power station is old and has to be put out of action. So what does G stand for?
Greed.
Aha, it might.
Greed?
That would be the consolation, the nature writing as consolation. I haven't intended this to be nature writing as consolation.
Your name?
No, it's not my name. That would be egocentric, wouldn't it? Not egocentric. Can I just draw your attention to the sea is going out in rivulets, okay, in a star-pulled tide drain. So the G here stands for gravity. So here is a possible source of energy. At this very point, there is a controversial proposal to put a barrage across the River Severn between Bristol and Cardiff, to put turbines in the middle of a wall and use the tide's energy for alternative power. So I'm really... So, with literature's indirectness, and perhaps a bit too indirect, with literature's indirectness, I'm kind of hinting that there is an alternative here to this Hinkley power station, and Hinkley G could be driven by the tides. Yeah? Once they're built, Hinkley C, and they're decommissioning it. And it isn't dated as yet for decommissioning. It's eternal, the tide going in now. Okay. Just finally, a letter I wrote to the Guardian newspaper last year, 2 years ago now, about building these tidal barrages. People object to the effect they're going to have on wildlife. Michael Grange recommends not asking the frogs first before building tidal barrages on the Severn. But we are already being spoken to by the sand eels, mosquitoes. We now have mosquitoes in the south of England, we never had before. The sand eels are disappearing because the sea is warming around Britain, and so puffins, for example, who live on sand eels, are no longer being found on British coasts. The sand eels are already moving, right? We are already being spoken to by the sand eels, mosquitoes, birds, butterflies, and even the humble Highland saxifrage, if only we would listen. They are on the move already. The environmental effects of sea level rise will dramatically alter the Severn estuary and all its inhabitants if we do little to deploy alternatives to fossil fuels now. Can the seriousness of the crisis justify the sacrifice of some present wetlands in order to avoid them being found far inland by our great-grandchildren? So here I come back to my granddaughter. I always like to end by saying, what would Virgil and Theocritus say about climate change and the position we find ourselves in? Well, here's a line from the Georgics. Countrymen whose lives are wanderings in the dark. Is that us? Wandering in the dark of the Anthropocene? In unfamiliar territory, we must work to ascertain its changing weather and winds' moods. We're now in unfamiliar territory of climate change. Don't we need, as Virgil suggests, to ascertain its changing weather and winds' mood? Don't we need to listen to the environment and what it is telling us? Listen to the sand eels, the mosquitoes, the birds that are moving. Okay? As Theocritus put it in the Idylls, no one can be saved by ignorance when the thread unwinds on the fateful bobbin. So, no one can be saved by ignorance. We know we are confronting an environmental crisis. Only people like Trump and fools like him in America and elsewhere deny climate change. 99% of scientists agree around the world that we are in the Anthropocene. No one can be saved by ignorance when the thread unwinds on the fateful bobbin. So I end with the words from the 3rd century BC written for the court in Alexandria
Yes.
by Theocritus. Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Oh my God. Eco-criticism is not a luxury. No.
Exactly.
It's not a luxury. We really have to do something. We have, let's say, 10 minutes for questions and comments, and I'm not going to ask questions today. I felt really guilty about asking questions, having the mic in my hand. I don't have a mic in my hand. Please go ahead and ask. Yes.
Excuse me, Professor Gifford. I'm so curious to know, what about the reply of the Guardian?
Oh, the reply
Yeah.
in the Guardian to my letter?
Exactly.
I was curious too about this.
I don't think there were any replies to my letter.
Either practical or even a written one?
No, there wasn't. Not in the Guardian. No, no. I think the point was made. Several friends of mine, of course, read it because we're all Guardian readers. The Guardian foregrounds the environment as news on a daily basis. Amongst all the national newspapers in the UK, the Guardian really does focus on the environmental crisis as news. But I didn't expect any answers. I just was asking, I was just saying, we have difficult policy decisions to make, and the crisis is so big that we might have to sacrifice some nature reserves and flood them now in order that they don't get flooded by sea level rise later, because there will be. Right? So it's very difficult for naturalists to agree to the flooding of nature reserves. I mean, the birds will move where the marshlands are, and doubtless some of them will be affected. But we need to face difficult decisions and make radical policy changes in order to confront the degree of the crisis. For example, when I go to China, I now see that university campuses have solar panels on the top of all the street lighting around campus, and all of the service workers servicing the campus, you know, the sweepers and cleaners and so on, are all driving electric cars, electric buggies, right? Now China is still building coal-fired power stations, but they know that they're going to be the last generation of them. They're industrializing fast to catch up with the West, but they know, and they're preparing to be environmentally friendly as soon as they can, as soon as they've caught up. So just little things like university campuses have changed in the last few years since I've been visiting China. Now eco-criticism is encouraged by the Chinese government. I sat on a panel with the Chinese representative at the Paris conference on climate change the last time I was there, which wouldn't have happened the first time I went, you know. So very interesting how when a decision is made by a government, and of course it's easy for an authoritarian government, I'll say no more, in China, to make those policy changes in the right, direction. But I go to Spain, no solar panels on roofs at all. The British government has just taken away subsidy for people to put solar panels on their roofs and made it more expensive for them to do so. So these policies are varying, but it's possible. Yeah, it's possible. And I think, the study of literature and what we're doing with students as well to encourage environmental awareness in the reading of literature is all part of the drip, drip, drip of cultural shift which is needed for these things to become the norm, you know. So I didn't expect an answer. I expected an intervention saying, let's consider the barrages, you know, and avoid building a new nuclear power station, the waste from which will be stored on that power station site because we don't know what to do with it long term for posterity.
The problem is with these measures that they may be taken in countries like China.